So I wanted to talk about game difficulty, difficulty settings, and my own personal journey and perspective on game difficulty. Because I think a lot of us here play, usually at least, on the hardest difficulty available. That's what I historically have done my entire gaming life, to be perfectly honest. In the last year or two, I have to say, though, I have sort of come to a revelation, although a revelation might be the wrong word, because it's not really very revelatory. It's more a conclusion I've come to personally. Now, if you notice in the title, I say, sometimes I don't play on the hardest difficulty anymore. And that's exactly the point I want to elaborate on. You see, generally speaking, historically, as I've said, I've always sort of de facto automatically played on the hardest difficulty, and on top of that, it was frequently because the hardest difficulty was the most fun. And we all know why we enjoy the hardest difficulty of any given game. Usually it's because we like the challenge, we like the idea of creative builds and different interactions, and then escaping by the nape of your neck in a tough battle, and just barely winning out in the end. And even those very difficult battles which we lose, 5 or 10 times, we finally win the end. Nothing beats that dopamine rush at the end of the day. But I've learned many lessons over the years, and a lot of this just comes down to how difficulty is designed in games. And all too often, it's just a fact, difficulty is designed around sponginess, high saving throws, the player receiving extra damage, and this sort of thing. A perfect example of this would be from a game that I consider to be one of my favorite games of all time, and that is Pathfinder: Wrath of the Righteous. Now, I have played Pathfinder: Wrath of the Righteous for almost the entirety of the game on Unfair. I've nearly beaten the game, but I sort of had this eureka moment after a while. Because what Unfair does in Wrath of the Righteous, or any Pathfinder game for that matter that Owlcat has made, is unfortunately just stat bloat. And that's the problem. You see, if you've never played these games before, basically Unfair difficulty is literally unfair. The enemies have absurdly high saves, they're absurdly tanky, they can one-shot you easily, and this sort of thing. And what this leads to, of course, is the player being very restricted and limited in the types of builds he wants to play in order to bypass the sponginess and the stat bloat. And the most important salient factor here, which is a funny one, is that it's just not fun. I got through something like 80% of Wrath of the Righteous on Unfair, and just turned it down to hard at some point in time, and I realized that hard was a lot more fun than Unfair ever was. Now, as is always the case, to each his own. There's some people that just really enjoy the bloated stats and the sponginess, that's fine. But for me, it just wasn't fun. And that was a moment of revelation between 2 or 3 years ago that I had, where I just thought to myself, I don't need to always play on the hardest difficulty if it's not fun. And I asked myself why I was playing the hardest difficulty in the first place, and the original reason was because I enjoyed the challenge. I liked the challenge, i.e. the challenge was fun. But Unfair on, say, Wrath of the Righteous or Kingmaker, for me at least, is not fun. I can do it, I've done it, I probably could beat the game too, I came very close, but at some point I realized it just wasn't fun. And that was the true eureka moment for me, in the sense that I asked myself, why am I playing this game? It's to have fun, right? You play games to have fun, generally speaking. There are other reasons to play games, but the primary reason is to have fun. And if you're not having fun, what's the point? And then you have other cases of games that just I'm not very invested in. So for example, I'm waiting for all of the DLC or expansions to drop for Rogue Trader, Warhammer 40k, because I'll probably only do one playthrough of the entire game ever. And to that end, I'll probably end up playing on Core, because I originally was playing on Unfair, then Hard, and I just thought, I'm not super invested in 40k. I want to give the game a full playthrough, a shot, because Owlcat made it, and I respect Owlcat. But because I'm not super invested in the universe, it's just not doing it for me to play on the hardest difficulty, even though I've heard, of course, that Unfair in 40k is significantly easier than the equivalent Unfair in Pathfinder games. And I don't want to be negative towards Owlcat. This doesn't just include Owlcat. There are tons of games out there, Bethesda, that do stat bloat and just sponginess. So playing the Oblivion remake, right? I initially started playing on Master difficulty. And what does Master difficulty do in Oblivion? Well, the same thing it does in every Bethesda game. It just makes the enemies bloated and spongy. They do a lot of damage, and they take a hell of a lot of damage. And that's just not an interesting measure of difficulty when you think about it. And I understand it too. I'm not a game developer, but it seems logical to me that the easiest thing you could do to make enemies quote-unquote more challenging is to just add health to them, make them do more damage, give them absurdly high saves, this sort of thing. But it's certainly not a creative solution. Now, I'm about to say something controversial when it comes to difficulty. I think that Larian, vis-a-vis Baldur's Gate 3, did it right. Now, Baldur's Gate 3, even on the hardest difficulty, is not hard at all, especially for veterans of CRPGs, there's no question about that. But with the addition of Honor Mode, because you're not just looking at difficulty then, you're looking at all the other little things you could do or shouldn't do. You're not save scumming anymore, you're looking at the total picture of the enemies, so to speak. And you start to take into consideration other things, such as, for example, Shadowheart always having at least one level 1 spell slot available to take the slot of Sanctuary. In case the going gets tough, the party gets wiped, she can pop Sanctuary and get out of there. Or for the main character, always having an invisibility potion. Or if I'm playing a Dwergar, only using invisibility once to enter combat to get surprise, and saving the extra invisibility usage to escape if I have to, this sort of thing. I think that's a much more interesting way of approaching difficulty, because it's much more comprehensive. It makes you think about different outcomes and possibilities, and sometimes it's just really funny. Again, Honor Mode is not technically hard, it's an endurance match. It's basically a marathon, and you can end up screwing things up in a really funny way. I played Honor Mode once, and I was still in the beginning chapter, and all the party got lit on fire. I defeated the enemy and thought everything was fine, but little did I know that the health of the entire party was really low, and the entire party got burnt to death and I lost the Honor Mode run. I find that much more humorous and funny than going up against stat blocks and health bloat and this sort of thing. Now, I do think the AI is another factor, so I'm using a lot of AI enhancement mods for Baldur's Gate 3 to make Honor Mode more interesting and tactical. So, melee characters will frequently coat their weapons in poison, enemy casters will make use of different types of spells to crowd control you, and archers and range characters typically have more elemental arrows more readily available, which they will deploy very frequently. And generally speaking, I think the solution to game difficulty, especially in CRPGs, is not stat bloat. It's more inventive, constructive, creative AI, and things like you have an Honor Mode where you have to pay attention to other details, because you only have one save. I personally think that's the future, because I've noticed with Bethesda that difficulty in Bethesda is artificial, it's boring, it's just not fun, and they have no way of improving that. Now, it's true for Skyrim, you have various mods that improve difficulty and give more tactical AI to the enemies, and they do help the game. But this is after a decade of modding. This is after tons and tons of modders have invested time and energy in Skyrim, but you're never going to get that type of AI tactical difficulty right out of the box, unfortunately, because it's God Howard and Bethesda. And other developers, and I do love Owlcat, they're one of my favorite studios out there, it goes without saying, can take lessons and learn things too. I just don't think that stat bloat and sponginess is a fun mechanic. And at the end of the day, if you're in it to have fun, which most of us are if we're going to play a game, that's the most important factor. It's why I don't always play on the hardest difficulty if I think the hardest difficulty is contrived and not well executed. At the end of the day, until developers come up with more interesting and dynamic ways of designing difficulty, apart from sponginess and stat bloat, I'm probably going to tend more and more to lower the difficulty for the sake of fun and, frankly speaking, expediency. I don't want to spend an eternity on a game just because the enemies have 200 gazillion hit points and saves up to the wazoo. It's just not fun for me. But in any event, let me know what you think about game difficulty and how you go about playing games, as I'd be very interested in seeing your comments. As always, thank you for tuning in, much appreciated. If you like my content and you like my takes, you can leave a like, comment, share, and subscribe. Much appreciated as it helps out the channel, and I'll check you out next time. Take care.